That girl has to go. Right now. Victoria Cross's voice sliced through the hushed luxury of the Gulfstream G700's cabin like a blade through silk. She wasn't making a request. She was issuing a command. Her manicured finger pointed across the aisle with the precision of a prosecutor identifying a criminal in court. The target of her fury was a young black woman, maybe 19, curled up in seat 3B with her knees tucked beneath her. She wore charcoal gray joggers that cost more than most people's rent, an oversized NYU hoodie, and pristine limited edition sneakers that hadn't seen a single scuff mark. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was sketching quietly in a leather-bound notebook, earbuds and completely absorbed in her work. She looked up briefly when Victoria's voice cut through her music. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. The young woman's expression was calm, almost amused, before she looked back down at her sketch and continued drawing. That dismissal made Victoria's blood pressure spike. "Excuse me," Victoria snapped, her voice rising an octave. "I'm talking to you." Elena Rodriguez, the flight attendant, appeared from the galley with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent 15 years managing difficult passengers. She was 30, with kind eyes and infinite patience, wearing the crisp uniform of executive aviation. But even her professional calm couldn't hide the tension that had just filled the cabin. "Is there a problem?" Miss Cross Elena asked, her voice steady and professional. Victoria turned on her like a heat-seeking missile. "Yes, there's a problem. A major one." She gestured again toward the young woman. "That girl doesn't belong here. This is supposed to be an exclusive charter flight. I specifically requested a sterile environment for my preparations." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Sterile environment. The phrase was chosen, carefully designed to cut without technically crossing legal lines. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Elena said, her professional mask slipping slightly. "I'm not sure I understand the issue. Miss Thompson is a confirmed passenger with a valid Thompson." Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, that's rich. Let me guess. Scholarship girl, frequent flyer points. Some kind of diversity initiative." Mark Stevens. Victoria's 28-year-old assistant shifted uncomfortably in the seat across from her. He was pale nervous and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. His job was to anticipate Victoria's needs and smooth her path through the world. Right now, he was failing spectacularly. Carol Mark whispered, using her preferred nickname. "Maybe we should just focus on the presentation. We have 3 hours to—" "Don't!" Victoria's voice was ice. "Don't you dare minimize this, Mark. Do you have any idea what this deal means, Thompson Aerospace Industries? $15 billion in government contracts. The biggest pitch of our careers. I need absolute focus, and I cannot concentrate with distractions." The young woman in 3B finally looked up from her sketchbook. Her voice when she spoke was calm and clear. "This seat is mine. I'm not asking for permission." Victoria stared at her mouth slightly open. In 15 years of corporate warfare, she'd rarely encountered such quiet confidence from someone so young, it threw her completely off balance. "Excuse me?" Victoria's voice dripped condescension. "Do you know who I am?" "No," the young woman replied simply. "Should I—" Mark made a small choking sound. Elena's eyes widened. Victoria's face flushed red. "I am Victoria Cross, senior partner at Meridian Capital. I manage over $2 billion in assets. I do not have conversations with people who look like they just rolled out of a dorm room. And you sound like someone who's never been told no before." The young woman's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath the silk. She closed her sketchbook and gave Victoria her full attention. "But there's a first time for everything." The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the whisper of air conditioning and the distant hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. 5 other passengers who had been politely ignoring the exchange were now openly staring. James Mitchell, A 55-year-old white businessman in an expensive navy suit cleared his throat from seat 1A. Perhaps the young lady would be more comfortable in coach, he suggested, his voice carrying the automatic authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Carlos Rivera, a 35-year-old Hispanic tech entrepreneur, shot him a look from across the aisle. "There is no coach on this aircraft," he said quietly. "It's all first class." "Well then," James continued unfazed, "surely there's somewhere else she could sit." The galley, perhaps Elena's professional mask, finally cracked. "Sir, I cannot ask a ticketed passenger to move till you can, and you will," Victoria interrupted. "I am paying for this flight. Well, my firm is paying. We chartered this aircraft specifically for privacy and preparation time. I have the most important meeting of my career in 6 hours, and I will not have my concentration broken by... She gestured vaguely at the young woman, searching for words that wouldn't get her sued. "By me existing," the young woman finished helpfully. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Mark tried again to defuse the situation. "Carol, please. Let's just review the Thompson Industries file. We need to go over the technical specifications for the..." "The Thompson file?" Victoria said slowly, her eyes never leaving the young woman. "You know what? You're right, Mark. Let's discuss Thompson Industries. Let's talk about how David Thompson built his aerospace empire from nothing, how he demands excellence from everyone he works with, how he has zero tolerance for people who don't belong in his world." She leaned forward slightly. "I wonder what he'd think about finding stowaways on executive aircraft." The young woman smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "I wouldn't know," she said. "Why don't you ask him?" Something in her tone made Elena take a step closer. The flight attendant had been watching this exchange with growing unease, and now she was studying the young woman's face with new interest. "Miss Thompson," Elena said carefully, "would you like me to call ahead and confirm your ground transportation in Los Angeles?" Victoria's head snapped toward Elena. "Thompson. Her name is actually Thompson." "Yes, ma'am. Miss Kira Thompson." "That's quite a coincidence," James Mitchell observed from his seat. "Same name as the CEO we're going to see?" Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Oh, I see what's happening here. This is some kind of setup, isn't it? Corporate espionage. You're trying to sabotage our presentation." Kira looked at her with something approaching pity. "You really believe the world revolves around you, don't you?" Susan Blake, a 60-year-old white woman with silver hair and expensive jewelry, had been silent up until now. She was a philanthropist, someone who prided herself on doing good in the world. But she was also someone who understood the social order, who knew her place in the hierarchy and expected others to know theirs. Perhaps she said delicately, "There's been some kind of mistake with the reservations." "There's been no mistake," Kira said firmly. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Wearing sweats," Victoria muttered, "to a $75 million aircraft. What I wear is my choice, not when it affects other passengers." "How exactly does my clothing affect you?" Victoria paused. It was a fair question, and they both knew it. But she'd gone too far to back down now. "It's about standards," she said finally. "It's about maintaining the integrity of premium travel. When you lower the bar for one person, you lower it for everyone." "Whose bar?" Kira asked quietly. "Whose standards?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elena found herself holding her breath. Even Mark had stopped fidgeting with his laptop and was listening intently. "Society's standards," Victoria said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. "Society," Kira repeated. "You mean your society. I mean civilized society. And I'm not civilized because I'm wearing comfortable clothes. You're not civilized because you don't understand your place." The words slipped out before Victoria could stop them. The mask had finally fallen completely away, revealing the ugly truth underneath. Elena stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to—" "My place." Kira interrupted, her voice still calm, but now carrying an edge that made everyone in the cabin sit up straighter, "is wherever I choose to put myself. And right now, I choose to be in seat 3B. She opened her sketchbook again and returned to her drawing, effectively dismissing Victoria with the same casual indifference that had started this entire confrontation. Victoria stared at her, speechless with rage. Her carefully constructed world where money and status determined worth, where she could move people around like chess pieces, had just been challenged by a teenager in sweatpants. And the teenager was winning. The cabin had transformed from a luxury travel environment into something resembling a courtroom with invisible battle lines drawn across the aisle. Elena stood in the center, caught between her professional obligations and her growing discomfort with Victoria's behavior. The other passengers, who had paid substantial sums for the privacy and exclusivity of charter travel, found themselves unwilling witnesses to a conflict that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Mark Stevens pulled out his phone and began typing frantically. He was texting his assistant back in New York, trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage this situation before it destroyed their chances with Thompson Industries. The irony wasn't lost on him that they were harassing someone with the same name as their prospective client, but Victoria was too deep in her rage to see the potential disaster looming ahead. "I want to speak to the pilot," Victoria announced suddenly. "I want this aircraft turned around. I want that girl removed before we take off." Ma'am, Elena said carefully. "We're already in the air. We've been airborne for 20 minutes. Victoria's face went white. In her fury, she'd lost track of time and missed the takeoff entirely. The gentle hum she'd attributed to ground power was actually the aircraft's engines in cruise flight. Carlos Rivera looked up from his laptop. "I think everyone needs to take a deep breath here. We're stuck together for the next few hours, whether we like it or not." "I don't have to like it," Victoria snapped. "And I don't have to pretend this is normal." "What exactly isn't normal?" Carlos asked. A young woman reading quietly in her assigned seat. "A young woman who clearly doesn't belong in first class," James Mitchell interjected, supporting Victoria's position. "Let's be honest about what we're all thinking." "What are we all thinking?" "Susan." Blake asked, her voice carefully neutral. James gestured toward Kira. "Look at her. Look at how she's dressed. Look at her age. Does she look like she can afford a $15,000 seat on a charter flight? How exactly is someone supposed to look when they can afford something?" Carlos shot back. "I founded a company worth $200 million and I'm wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Does that disqualify me from being here?" "That's different," Victoria said. "How is it different?" Victoria paused. She couldn't say what she really meant, not directly. Not on a flight that might be recording audio. But everyone in the cabin understood the subtext. "It just is," she said, finally. Kira looked up from her sketchbook. "Mr. Mitchell." "Right. I heard Elena use your name earlier. Can I ask you something?" James straightened in his seat, clearly pleased to be acknowledged. "Of course. When you were 19, did anyone ever tell you that you didn't belong somewhere because of how you looked?" James opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. The question was more complex than it appeared on the surface. "That's not really the same thing," he said finally. "Why not? Because He trailed off, realizing that any answer he gave would reveal more about his assumptions than hers. "Because you never had to think about it," Kira finished gently. "Because you always belonged wherever you wanted to go." Susan Blake shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She'd spent her adult life writing checks to organizations that fought inequality, but she'd never been forced to confront it in such intimate quarters. I think she said carefully that we should all try to be more understanding of each other. I'm being very understanding, Victoria said. I understand that there's been a mistake, and I'm trying to correct it politely. Politely, Carlos laughed. You've demanded that she be removed, suggested she's a stowaway, implied she's involved in corporate espionage, and questioned her right to exist in the same space as you. What exactly about that strikes you as polite? I never said she couldn't exist, Victoria protested. Just not here, not in your sight, not where you have to acknowledge her as an equal. She's not my equal. The words dropped into the cabin like a bomb. Even Mark winced and looked up from his phone. Elena's professional composure finally cracked completely. Ma'am, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. I need you to stop this conversation right now. No, Victoria said, rising from her seat. I will not stop. I will not be silenced. I am a paying customer on this flight and I have rights. So does she? Elena pointed out. Not the same rights. Kira closed her sketchbook with a soft snap. The sound was barely audible, but it commanded everyone's attention. You know what's interesting? She said, her voice still perfectly calm. You keep talking about rights and belonging and standards, but you haven't asked me a single question about who I am or why I'm here. You've just made assumptions based on what you see. I don't need to ask, Victoria said. It's obvious. What's obvious? Victoria gestured at her again. You're clearly not supposed to be here. According to who? According to common sense. Kira smiled. Common sense. That's interesting. You know what my common sense tells me. She stood up, stretching to her full height. She was taller than she'd appeared sitting down, and there was something in her posture that suggested confidence built over years, not moments. My common sense tells me that someone who spends this much energy trying to prove they belong somewhere probably doesn't actually belong there at all. The observation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. How dare you? How dare I what? Point out that you're more worried about my presence than your own presentation, that you've spent more time trying to have me removed than preparing for the most important meeting of your career. Mark's head snapped up from his phone. He'd been so focused on damage control that he hadn't considered the implications for their actual business. Victoria had been scheduled to spend the flight reviewing technical specifications and rehearsing key talking points. Instead, she'd wasted an hour on this confrontation. Carol, he said quietly. She's right. We haven't touched the Thompson file. Victoria whirled on him. Whose side are you on? I'm on the side of us not completely humiliating ourselves in 6 hours. Elena saw an opportunity to de-escalate and seized it. Perhaps I could set up the conference area in the rear of the cabin. You could spread out your materials, have some privacy for your preparations. I don't want privacy, Victoria said. I want her gone. Well, that's not happening, Elena replied firmly. So what's your second choice? The question forced Victoria to confront reality. She could continue this fight for the next 3 hours, accomplishing nothing except further humiliating herself in front of witnesses. Or she could salvage what remained of her professionalism and try to recover the situation. Pride warred with pragmatism. Pride was winning. My second choice, Victoria said slowly, is to file a complaint with the charter company. I want a full refund for this flight. I want that girl's ticket investigated. And I want assurances that this kind of security breach will never happen again. Kira looked up at her with something approaching amusement. Security breach, she repeated. Is that what I am? You're something, Victoria muttered. Yes, Kira agreed. I am. The simple confidence in her voice sent a chill down Elena's spine. There was something about this young woman that didn't quite add up. The expensive, casual clothes, the complete lack of intimidation, the way she spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Elena had worked private aviation long enough to recognize certain patterns. The children of the ultra-wealthy often flew dressed like college students precisely because they had nothing to prove to anyone. They wore comfort over status because status was simply assumed. Could it be possible that Victoria had just made the mistake of a lifetime? Elena decided to test her theory. "Miss Thompson," she said carefully, "I'll be starting meal service shortly. Do you have any dietary restrictions I should know about? Any preferences from your previous flights?" The phrasing was deliberate. Previous flights implied familiarity with the aircraft and its services. Kira looked up at her with a small smile. "The usual is fine, Elena. You know what I like." Elena nodded and moved toward the galley, her suspicions now confirmed. This wasn't Kira's first time on this aircraft. The flight attendant had been too nervous and focused on the confrontation to recognize her immediately, but she knew that voice, that calm confidence. She'd served Kira Thompson multiple times over the past 2 years. As the daughter of David Thompson, CEO and founder of Thompson Industries, the same David Thompson that Victoria Cross was flying to Los Angeles to pitch. Elena reached for the aircraft's communication system, then stopped. This wasn't her business to interfere with. But she couldn't help wondering what would happen when they landed and the truth inevitably came out. She glanced back at Victoria, who was still standing in the aisle, still radiating righteous indignation. The woman had no idea what storm was heading her way. The cabin had settled into an uneasy détente, but it was the kind of quiet that precedes an explosion, rather than genuine peace. Victoria had returned to her seat, but remained hypervigilant, watching Kira's every movement like a security guard monitoring a shoplifter. Mark had finally opened his laptop and was making a valiant attempt to review their presentation materials, but his attention kept drifting to the ongoing tension. Elena moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, but her mind was racing. She'd recognized Kira, now remembered the quiet, polite young woman who'd flown this route dozens of times over the past 2 years. The daughter of one of the most powerful men in aerospace, someone who could buy and sell everyone on this aircraft without checking his bank balance. And Victoria Cross had spent the last hour trying to have her thrown off the plane. Elena had seen corporate disasters unfold before, but never quite like this. Never with such oblivious certainty from the person digging their own grave. The fragile peace was shattered when Victoria's phone rang. "Stephen Holt." She answered curtly. This better be important. Stephen Holt was her managing partner, the man who'd entrusted her with the Thompson Industries account. His voice was tinny but audible in the quiet cabin. "Victoria, I just got word from our advance team in Los Angeles. Thompson's people want to move the meeting up by 2 hours. Something about a scheduling conflict." Victoria's face went pale. 2 hours? That gives us barely 90 minutes after landing to set up. Can you handle it? Victoria glanced around the cabin, her eyes landing on Kira, who appeared to be ignoring the conversation entirely. "There have been some complications on the flight," Victoria said carefully. "Security issues. But I'll manage." "Security issues? What kind of security issues?" Victoria lowered her voice, but in the confined space everyone could still hear her. "Questionable passengers. People who shouldn't be here." "I'm handling it." James Mitchell leaned forward, inserting himself into the conversation. "I can confirm that he said loudly enough for the phone to pick up. Very concerning situation. Makes you wonder about the charter company's screening process." Stephen's voice crackled through the phone speaker. "Are you telling me there's a security threat on your aircraft?" "Not a threat exactly." Victoria backpedaled, realizing how her words might sound to someone not present for the context. "More of a authenticity issue. Speak plainly, Victoria." Victoria glanced at Kira again, then made her decision. "There's a young woman on board who clearly doesn't belong here. Expensive flight casual clothes, suspicious circumstances. I'm concerned about corporate espionage or some kind of setup." The word espionage sent a visible shiver through the cabin. Carlos Rivera closed his laptop and stared at Victoria in disbelief. "You think she's a spy?" he asked incredulously. "I think she's something," Victoria replied, "and I think it's awfully convenient that she shares a name with our client." Stephen's voice came through the phone again. "Did you say she shares Thompson's name, Kira Thompson? Claims it's a coincidence." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Stephen spoke again, his voice had changed completely. "Victoria," he said slowly, "please tell me you haven't been harassing David Thompson's daughter for the past hour." The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Victoria's face went from pale to gray to green in rapid succession. "His daughter," she whispered. "Kira Thompson, 19 years old, NYU art student. She's been featured in Aerospace Weekly as one of the industry's rising young talents. Her sculpture work is displayed in her father's corporate headquarters." Victoria's phone slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. Kira looked up from her sketchbook with a perfectly calm expression. "Surprise," she said quietly. The cabin erupted. Mark Stevens made a sound like a dying animal. James Mitchell slapped his forehead and muttered something unprintable. Susan Blake covered her mouth with her hands. Carlos Rivera started laughing a deep belly laugh that shook his entire body. "Oh my God," Mark breathed. "Oh my God. Carol, what have you done?" Victoria couldn't speak. She'd been struck dumb by the magnitude of her mistake. For the past hour, she'd been systematically insulting and attempting to humiliate the daughter of the man who controlled her career future. Elena moved swiftly to retrieve Victoria's phone, which was still connected to the call with Stephen Holt. "Mr. Holt." Elena said into the phone, "This is Elena Rodriguez, your flight attendant. Perhaps you'd like to speak directly with Miss Thompson." Kira shook her head. "That's not necessary. I think Mr. Holt and Ms. Cross have enough to discuss without my input." Her voice was still perfectly calm, but there was something new in it now. Not anger, exactly. More like disappointment. Elena handed the phone back to Victoria, who took it with a shaking hand. "Stephen," she whispered. "Victoria, I want you to listen very carefully. You are going to apologize to Miss Thompson immediately and profusely. You are going to spend the rest of that flight in complete silence. And when you land, you are going to pray that David Thompson is in a forgiving mood, because if he's not, your career is over." The line went dead. Victoria stared at the phone for a long moment, then slowly raised her eyes to meet Kira's. She began, then stopped. What words could possibly undo the last hour? "You... what?" Kira asked, gently. "I didn't know. You didn't know what... that I was someone important, that I had a right to be here, that I deserved basic human respect." Each question was delivered with surgical precision, exposing the rotted foundation of Victoria's worldview. "I made assumptions," Victoria admitted. "Yes, you did, based on what Victoria couldn't answer. Any honest response would only dig her grave deeper. Based on how she looked," she admitted finally. "How she looked," Kira repeated. "You mean because she's black?" The word hung in the air like an accusation. Victoria flinched as if she'd been struck. "I don't think of myself as a racist," she said desperately. "Ms. Cross, what you think about yourself is irrelevant. What matters is how you behave. And your behavior today was textbook racial profiling." James Mitchell, who had been silent since the revelation, finally found his voice. "Miss Thompson," he said formally, "I owe you an apology as well. I spoke out of turn and made comments that were inappropriate and presumptuous." Kira nodded acknowledgement, but didn't respond verbally. Carlos Rivera leaned forward in his seat. "For what it's worth, I thought this whole thing was ridiculous from the beginning. No one should be treated the way you were treated." "Thank you," Kira said simply. Susan Blake cleared her throat. I should have spoken up sooner. I'm sorry for my silence." "Your silence was noted," Kira replied, her tone making it clear that Susan's inaction had been just as hurtful as the other's aggression. Elena, still standing in the aisle, felt compelled to address the situation professionally. "Miss Cross," she said formally, "I need to inform you that this incident will be reported to both the charter company and Mr. Thompson's security team. The aircraft is equipped with audio recording devices for safety purposes, so there will be a complete record of this flight's events." Victoria made another small, whimpering sound. Mark Stevens looked up from his laptop where he'd been frantically trying to calculate the financial damage to their firm. "Kira, Miss Thompson," he said desperately, "is there anything we can do? Anything at all? This was all a misunderstanding. A horrible, awful misunderstanding." Kira closed her sketchbook and looked directly at him. "Mr. Stevens, right? You've spent this entire flight enabling your boss's behavior. You knew it was wrong, but you said nothing meaningful to stop it. The only thing you seem concerned about is the business implications." Mark flinched as if she'd slapped him. "That's not... I tried to. You tried to quiet her because you were worried about the presentation. Not because what she was saying was cruel and wrong." The accuracy of her observation hit Mark like a physical blow. She was right. His objections had been strategic, not moral. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I should have done more." "Yes," Kira agreed. "You should have." Victoria finally found her voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Miss Thompson, I am deeply, profoundly sorry. I was completely out of line. I said inexcusable things. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I realize how wrong I was." Kira studied her for a long moment. "Ms. Cross, do you know what the worst part of this has been?" Victoria shook her head. "It's not that you assumed I didn't belong here. It's not even that you tried to have me removed. It's that when you thought I was nobody important, you felt entitled to treat me as less than human. My worth to you was entirely dependent on my status and my connections." Victoria's face crumpled. The truth was devastating because it was absolute. "That says something about your character that no apology can fix." Kira continued. "You're not sorry you treated me badly. You're sorry you treated the wrong person badly." The observation hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria couldn't argue with it because they both knew it was true. Elena, who had been listening to the entire exchange, felt a profound respect for the young woman's composure and insight. At 19, Kira Thompson possessed a clarity and strength that most people never developed. The rest of the flight passed in oppressive silence. Victoria stared out the window, her career and reputation crumbling around her in real time. Mark worked frantically on damage control scenarios, though they both knew the situation was likely beyond salvage. The other passengers retreated into their own thoughts, processing what they'd witnessed and their own roles in it. And Kira returned to her sketching as calm and focused as she'd been when the flight began. But Elena noticed that she was no longer drawing aircraft designs. Now she was sketching faces. The faces of everyone in the cabin, capturing not just their features, but their expressions during the confrontation. She was creating a visual record of what prejudice looked like when it thought no one important was watching. The tension in the cabin had shifted from explosive confrontation to simmering humiliation, but the story was far from over. Tommy Martinez, a 22-year-old Hispanic college student returning to Los Angeles from his internship at a New York finance firm, had been quietly observing the entire exchange from his seat in the rear of the aircraft. Unlike the older passengers who seemed paralyzed by social convention and business concerns, Tommy belonged to a generation that instinctively reached for their phones when witnessing injustice. His finger hovered over his camera app as he watched Victoria Cross slowly disintegrate in her seat. The woman who had spent an hour demanding that Kira Thompson be removed from the aircraft was now slumped forward, her head in her hands, as the reality of her situation began to sink in. Tommy had recognized the dynamic immediately. He'd grown up in East LA, where assumptions about who belonged where were a daily reality. He'd watched his mother, a hotel housekeeping supervisor, be treated with suspicion and dismissal by guests who assumed she couldn't possibly understand their problems or deserve their respect. The only difference here was the price point of the discrimination. He pulled out his phone and began recording. "Excuse me." Kira's voice cut through the cabin's oppressive quiet. She was looking directly at Tommy, her expression serious but not angry. "What are you doing?" Tommy paused, his thumb still hovering over the record button. "This needs to be documented," he said. "People need to see what just happened." "No," Kira replied firmly. "They don't." "But words, not views." Kira interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "If you want to help, use your voice, not your camera. If you have something to say about what you witnessed, say it now to the people who need to hear it. Don't post about it later to people who weren't here." Tommy lowered his phone slowly, struck by the conviction in her voice. "You're right," he said, sliding the device back into his pocket. "You're absolutely right." He stood up and walked to the front of the cabin, his young face set with determination. Elena watched him approach with curiosity, wondering what this new development would bring. Ms. Cross Tommy said, his voice carrying the careful respect of someone who'd been taught to honor his elders even when they didn't deserve it. "I need to tell you something." Victoria looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. She'd aged a decade in the past hour, her carefully maintained corporate facade replaced by the haggard appearance of someone watching their life collapse in real time. What she whispered. "I've been sitting back there for the past hour watching you try to humiliate that young woman. I've been quiet because I was raised to be respectful to my elders even when they're wrong. But I can't be quiet anymore." Tommy's voice grew stronger as he continued. "You assumed she didn't belong here because of how she looked. Because she's young and black and dressed comfortably. You thought you could push her around because you believed you had more power than her." Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but Tommy held up a hand. "I'm not finished. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see someone so insecure about their own place in the world that they have to tear other people down to feel important. I see someone who mistakes cruelty for strength." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Coming from someone young enough to be her son, they carried a particular sting. "My mother, Tommy, continued works in hotels. She's been doing it for 20 years. And I've watched people like you look right through her, assume she's ignorant or invisible, treat her like she's not worth basic courtesy. But you know what? She speaks 3 languages. She has a business degree and she's raised 4 kids who are all college graduates." Elena found herself nodding along with Tommy's words. She'd seen similar dynamics play out countless times in her years of service work. "The only difference between my mother and Miss Thompson over there," Tommy said, gesturing toward Kira, "is that Miss Thompson has the power to make your disrespect expensive. But that doesn't make your behavior any less wrong. It just makes the consequences more immediate." Victoria's face crumpled further. The young man's words were cutting precisely because they were true. Carlos Rivera, who had been quietly watching the exchange, stood up and joined Tommy in the front of the cabin. "He's right," Carlos said simply. "I've been in meetings where people looked at me and immediately assumed I was the tech support, not the CEO. I've had investors speak slower and louder when they heard my accent, as if being Latino meant I couldn't understand complex financial concepts." He looked directly at Victoria. "The difference is, I've learned to call it out immediately. I don't let people like you set the tone for how I'm treated. But not everyone has that luxury. Not everyone has the power or platform to fight back. James Mitchell, who had been silent since his earlier apology, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The conversation was forcing him to confront his own behavior, and he didn't like what he was seeing. Susan Blake, the philanthropist, finally found her voice as well. "I write checks," she said quietly, to organizations that fight exactly this kind of prejudice. "I attend galas. I give speeches about equality and justice. But when it happened right in front of me, I said nothing. I was more concerned about maintaining politeness than standing up for what's right." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "That makes me complicit. My silence was a choice, and it was the wrong choice." Elena, who had been trained to remain neutral in passenger conflicts, found herself unable to stay quiet any longer. "In 15 years of private aviation," she said, "I've seen wealthy passengers treat service staff, other passengers, and crew members as less than human. I've watched people use money as a weapon to intimidate and control others. But I've also seen the damage it does not just to the targets, but to the witnesses who say nothing." She looked around the cabin, making eye contact with each passenger in turn. "Every time we allow this behavior to go unchallenged, we make it normal. We make it acceptable. We give people like Miss Cross permission to continue treating others as inferior." Victoria made a small sound somewhere between a sob and a groan. Tommy turned to look at her again. "The thing is, Ms. Cross, this isn't really about Miss Thompson at all. She's going to be fine. She has family resources protection. This is about all the people who look like her who don't have those things. The people you've probably been treating this way for years without consequences." "How many others?" Carlos added. "How many other young women? How many service workers? How many people you perceived as powerless have you spoken to this way?" Victoria couldn't answer. The question forced her to confront a lifetime of small cruelties, casual dismissals, and automatic assumptions about who mattered and who didn't. Kira, who had been listening to the impromptu intervention with interest, finally spoke. "This is what I meant about using your voices," she said to Tommy and the others. "This conversation right here, right now, this is how change actually happens. Not through viral videos or public shaming, but through people being willing to speak truth to power in the moment." Tommy nodded, understanding. "My first instinct was to record you being humiliated and post it online. Make you a meme, ruin your reputation through social media." "Why didn't you?" Victoria asked weakly. "Because she taught me something better," Tommy replied, gesturing toward Kira. "Revenge and education aren't the same thing. If I'd posted that video, you might have been destroyed, but you wouldn't have learned anything. You'd just be a victim of cancel culture in your own mind." He sat down in the aisle seat across from Victoria, bringing himself to her eye level. "This way, you have to sit with what you did. You have to face the people you hurt and the people who witnessed it. You have to decide who you want to be going forward." Victoria wiped her eyes with a tissue Elena had quietly provided. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know who I want to be. I don't even know who I am anymore." "That's actually a good place to start," Susan Blake observed. "I've spent so much time managing my public image as a philanthropist that I forgot what real courage looks like. It's not writing checks from a position of safety. It's speaking up when it's uncomfortable." Carlos nodded agreement. "My company has diversity and inclusion training, harassment policies, all the right corporate language. But those are just words on paper unless people are willing to act when it matters." Elena, emboldened by the growing conversation, added her own perspective. "In service industries, we're trained to de-escalate conflicts and keep customers happy even when they're behaving badly. But there's a difference between good customer service and enabling abuse." I should have shut this down immediately. James Mitchell, who had been listening to everyone else with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "I suppose I owe everyone an explanation for my behavior as well," he said reluctantly. "When I supported Ms. Cross earlier, it wasn't because I really believed Miss Thompson didn't belong here. It was because I recognized Mrs. Cross as someone with power and influence, and I wanted to stay on her good side. His admission was particularly damning because of its honesty. I saw a successful white woman attacking a young black woman, and I instinctively sided with the person who looked like me and could potentially benefit my career. I didn't even think about right and wrong. I just thought about advantage. The cabin fell silent as everyone processed James's words. His confession had laid bare the unconscious calculations that often drove behavior in professional settings. Kira looked at him with something approaching respect. "Thank you for being honest about that," she said. "Most people would never admit to those kinds of calculations even to themselves." "It's an ugly truth," James replied. "But I'm starting to think ugly truths are better than comfortable lies." Tommy pulled out his phone again, but this time he held it differently. "Miss Thompson," he said, "would it be okay if I recorded you talking about this experience? Not for viral content, but for educational purposes. I work with a youth organization back home that deals with discrimination issues. They could learn from how you handled this situation." Kira considered the request carefully. "Only if everyone else agrees to participate as well," she said finally. "This shouldn't be about me as an individual. It should be about all of us as a community, including the people who made mistakes." She looked around the cabin. "Anyone who's not comfortable being part of that conversation doesn't have to be. But if we're going to do this, we do it together." Victoria, who had been silent during much of the recent conversation, looked up with surprise. "You'd include me?" "After everything I said and did." "Especially you," Kira replied. "Your perspective is the most important one. You're the one who has to decide whether this was a life-changing moment or just an embarrassing incident you'll try to forget." Victoria stared at her for a long moment as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Why, she asked, "Why would you give me that chance? I was horrible to you." Kira smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, it was a genuinely warm expression. "Because destroying you doesn't help the next person who's sitting in my seat when someone like you walks on board. But maybe if you really understand what happened here today, you can be the voice that speaks up for them instead of against them." The offer of redemption hung in the air like a lifeline. Victoria reached for it with trembling hands. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'll do the interview. I'll tell the truth about what I did and why it was wrong." Tommy nodded and began setting up his phone to record. But as he did, Elena noticed something through the cabin windows that made her blood run cold. A second aircraft was approaching their destination airport, coming in fast on a parallel course. She recognized the distinctive profile immediately, a Bombardier Global 8000, one of the fastest and most exclusive private jets in the world. David Thompson's personal aircraft. Elena quickly calculated the timing. They were still 40 minutes from landing, but the Bombardier was clearly planning to arrive first. And given the speed it was traveling, it hadn't been scheduled for this route when they departed New York. Someone had called David Thompson during the flight and told him what was happening. Elena moved quickly to the cockpit intercom. "Captain," she said quietly, "we may have a situation developing on the ground." The sight of the approaching Bombardier had sent Elena's mind racing, but she kept her observations to herself for the moment. The passengers were engaged in the most honest conversation she'd ever witnessed on a commercial flight, and she didn't want to interrupt the progress being made. Tommy had set up his phone and was beginning to record what would become an extraordinary document of accountability and education. "State your name and tell us what happened here today," Tommy said, pointing the camera first at Victoria. Victoria took a shaky breath and looked directly into the lens. Her usual corporate composure was completely gone, replaced by raw vulnerability. "My name is Victoria Cross. I'm a senior partner at Meridian Capital, and today I spent an hour attacking a 19-year-old woman because I made assumptions about who she was based on her appearance." She paused, struggling with the words. "I demanded that she be removed from this aircraft. I questioned her right to be here. I suggested she was involved in corporate espionage. I treated her as less than human because I believed I was superior to her." Tommy kept the camera steady. Why did you believe that? Because she's young and black and was dressed casually, and I'm older and white and was dressed professionally. In my mind, that meant I belonged here, and she didn't. What does that say about your worldview? Victoria's face crumpled slightly, but she continued. It says I believe that worth is determined by appearance and status. It says I think respect is something that has to be earned from me rather than something everyone deserves automatically. It says... She struggled with the final admission. It says I'm a racist. The word hung in the air like a confession at trial. Tommy didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of her admission settle. What are you going to do differently going forward? He asked finally. I don't know, Victoria admitted. I honestly don't know. I thought I was a good person. I thought I was professional and fair. But today showed me that I've been fooling myself. I need to figure out who I really am and who I want to be. Tommy turned the camera toward James Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, you supported Ms. Cross's position initially. Can you explain why James straightened in his seat, clearly uncomfortable but determined to be honest? I saw a conflict between a successful businesswoman and a young woman who didn't fit my image of a first-class passenger. My instinct was to side with the person who could potentially advance my career, rather than the person who was being mistreated. So your decision was purely transactional? Yes, James admitted. And that's inexcusable. I watched a young woman being harassed and bullied, and my first thought was about networking opportunities. Tommy moved to Carlos Rivera next. You pushed back against this behavior from the beginning. What made you speak up? Carlos leaned back in his seat, considering his answer. I've been on the receiving end of similar treatment. I know what it feels like to have people assume you don't belong somewhere, to have your presence questioned and your qualifications doubted. I couldn't watch it happen to someone else without saying something. But you didn't say much initially. Why not more honestly? Because I was also thinking about business implications. I didn't want to get too involved in someone else's drama. It wasn't until the situation escalated that I realized my silence was its own form of complicity. Susan Blake was next. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, but her usual composure was shattered. I pride myself on being an advocate for social justice, she said when Tommy pointed the camera at her. I write checks, I attend fundraisers, I give speeches. But when injustice happened right in front of me, I froze. Why do you think that was? Because it's easy to support justice in the abstract. It's much harder to disrupt social dynamics when you're personally involved. I was more concerned about maintaining civility than standing up for what's right. Tommy turned to Elena. As the flight attendant, you were in a difficult position. How do you balance customer service with protecting passengers from harassment? Elena had been dreading this question, but she answered honestly. I failed, she said simply. I should have stopped this immediately. I let it continue because I was trying to find a diplomatic solution that would satisfy everyone. But some situations don't have diplomatic solutions. Sometimes you have to choose a side. Finally, Tommy turned the camera toward Kira, who had been watching the interviews with interest. Miss Thompson, you're the person who was targeted in this situation. How do you want people to understand what happened here? Kira was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. I want people to understand that this isn't really about me, she said finally. I have protection privilege resources. My father is powerful enough to make sure people face consequences for treating me badly. But most people who experience this kind of discrimination don't have those advantages. She looked directly into the camera. Every day, people are judged, dismissed, and mistreated because others make assumptions about their worth based on appearance, accent, age, or perceived status. Most of them don't have the power to fight back. Most of them suffer in silence. What would you want those people to know, that their dignity isn't dependent on other people's recognition? that they have the right to exist in any space they can legitimately access, and that sometimes speaking up for yourself is the only way to protect the next person who'll be sitting in your seat. And what would you want the people doing the discriminating to understand? Kira's voice grew stronger. That your assumptions about who belongs where are probably wrong. That treating people badly because you think they can't hurt you is not just morally wrong, it's stupid. And that every interaction you have with another human being is a choice to either increase or decrease the amount of dignity and respect in the world. Tommy lowered the phone. Thank you, everyone. That was powerful. But as he finished speaking, Elena's voice came over the cabin intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to inform you that we've received word that another aircraft will be meeting us on the ground in Los Angeles. Please remain seated and prepare for what may be an unusual deplaning process. Victoria's head snapped up. What kind of aircraft? Elena hesitated, then decided honesty was the best policy given everything that had transpired. Mr. Thompson's personal jet. It appears he's flying in to meet us. The color drained from Victoria's face completely. Mark Stevens, who had been quietly working on his laptop during the interviews, looked up in terror. He's coming here. To the airport. In person. Elena nodded. That appears to be the case. Victoria stood up unsteadily, gripping the back of her seat for support. Miss Thompson, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Is there anything I can do? Anything at all. I know I don't deserve consideration after my behavior, but I'm begging you. My career, my firm, the people who work for me. Is there any way to make this right? Kira looked at her thoughtfully. Miss Cross, what exactly are you asking me to do? I don't know. Talk to your father. Explain that I made a mistake, that I'm sorry. You want me to protect you from the consequences of your own actions. Victoria's mouth opened and closed as she realized what she was asking. She began, then stopped. You're right. I'm asking you to save me from myself. That's not your responsibility. No, it's not. Kira agreed. But I'll tell you what I will do. Victoria waited, holding her breath. I'll tell him the truth about everything that happened, including the conversation we just had, including your apologies and your commitment to doing better. I won't minimize what you did, but I also won't maximize it. It was more than Victoria had any right to expect, and they both knew it. Why? Victoria asked. Because I believe people can change. Because I think you might actually mean it when you say you want to do better. And because my father taught me that grace is more powerful than revenge. Elena watched this exchange with growing respect for Kira's maturity. At 19, she was demonstrating wisdom that many people never developed. But Elena also knew David Thompson's reputation. He was known for being fair but unforgiving when it came to threats to his family. The fact that he was flying across the country to personally address this situation suggested that Victoria's career was likely over regardless of Kira's intervention. We're beginning our descent into Los Angeles, Elena announced. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. As the aircraft began its approach, Elena could see the Bombardier Global 8000 already on the ground, parked near the private terminal. Ground crews were positioning stairs and preparing for what appeared to be an immediate departure. David Thompson wasn't just coming to meet them. He was coming to take his daughter home. And Victoria Cross was about to face the most important meeting of her career, under circumstances she could never have imagined. The descent into Los Angeles felt like a countdown to Judgment Day. As the aircraft continued its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from confrontational to contemplative. The recorded interviews had created an unexpected sense of catharsis among the passengers. But the looming reality of David Thompson's presence on the ground cast a shadow over everything. Kira's phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the latter part of the flight, but she continued to ignore it. Elena noticed that each time the phone vibrated, Kira would glance at the screen, see her father's name, and deliberately decline the call. "Miss Thompson," Elena said quietly, approaching her seat. "Perhaps you should take his call. He's probably concerned about you." Kira shook her head. "He's probably furious, and he has every right to be. But I need him to understand that I handled this situation myself. If I take his call now, it becomes about his protection of me, rather than my own strength." Elena understood the dynamic immediately. Kira was establishing her independence, proving that she didn't need to be rescued. It was a powerful statement, but Elena wondered if the young woman truly understood the storm that was building around her. Victoria, meanwhile, was staring out the window at the approaching lights of Los Angeles, with the expression of someone watching their own execution. Mark had closed his laptop and was methodically organizing papers with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. Carol Mark said quietly, "We need to talk about what happens next." Victoria turned to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. "What's to talk about?" "It's over. All of it. Maybe not," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe if we approach this right. If we're completely honest and transparent." "Honest about what? That I spent an hour trying to humiliate his daughter, that I called her a security threat and suggested she was involved in corporate espionage, that I demanded she be removed from an aircraft her family owns." Mark winced. When laid out so starkly, the situation sounded even worse than he'd imagined. "The firm could survive this," he said desperately. "With the right crisis management, the right narrative." Victoria laughed bitterly. "Mark, there's no narrative that makes this okay. There's no spin that turns racial harassment into a misunderstanding." Tommy Martinez, who had been reviewing the video interviews on his phone, looked up at their conversation. "Ms. Cross," he said, "can I ask you something?" Victoria nodded listlessly. "Do you actually care about making this right, or are you just trying to minimize the damage to your career?" It was a brutal question, but a fair one. Victoria stared at him for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I keep saying I want to do better, but every thought I have is about saving my job and my reputation. I don't know if I'm capable of caring about anything else right now." The honesty was stark and uncomfortable, but it was also progress of a sort. Kira's phone buzzed again. This time she looked at the screen for a longer moment before declining the call. "How many times has he called?" Carlos Rivera asked. 17, Kira replied. "He's persistent when he's worried." "Maybe you should talk to him," Susan Blake suggested gently. "As a parent myself, I can only imagine what he's feeling right now." Kira considered this, then shook her head again. "He raised me to be strong and independent. If I call him crying for help every time someone treats me badly, I'm not living up to what he taught me." Elena, who had been listening to this conversation while monitoring the aircraft's approach, made a decision. She activated the cabin intercom and spoke to the cockpit. "Captain, could you patch me through to ground control? I need to relay a message to the aircraft on the ramp." There was a brief pause, then the captain's voice came back. "Elena, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Mr. Thompson specifically requested no communication until we're on the ground. Sir, with respect, I think he needs to hear this directly from his daughter." Kira looked up sharply. "Elena, no. Don't." "Miss Thompson," Elena said firmly, "your father flew 3,000 miles because someone reported that you were being harassed on this aircraft. He doesn't know that you handled the situation with grace and strength. He doesn't know about the conversation that happened afterward. All he knows is that someone hurt his daughter and he's coming to make them pay." The words landed like a physical blow. Kira had been so focused on maintaining her independence that she hadn't considered the broader implications of her silence. "You're right," she said quietly. "I need to talk to him." Elena nodded and spoke to the cockpit again. Captain Miss Thompson would like to speak with her father. Patching through now. The cabin speakers crackled to life, and suddenly David Thompson's voice filled the space. It was deep controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of barely restrained fury. "Kira, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Dad," Kira replied. Her voice stronger than Elena had expected. "I'm completely fine. I got a call from Stephen Holt at Meridian Capital. He said there was some kind of incident that you were being harassed by one of his employees." Victoria made a small whimpering sound at the mention of her boss's name. "There was an incident," Kira confirmed. "But I handled it. And we've had some important conversations since then." "What kind of conversations?" Kira glanced around the cabin, meeting the eyes of each passenger in turn. The kind that actually solve problems instead of just punishing people for having them. David's voice softened slightly. "What do you mean, Dad? The woman who was rude to me has spent the last hour confronting some ugly truths about herself. The other passengers who stayed silent have acknowledged their complicity. Everyone involved has committed to doing better. And you believe them?" Kira looked directly at Victoria as she answered, "I believe they want to do better. Whether they follow through is up to them." There was a long pause before David spoke again. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "But that doesn't mean there won't be consequences." Victoria's face went ashen. "I understand," Kira replied. "But I hope the consequences focus on education and change, rather than just punishment. We'll discuss it when you're safely on the ground." The communication ended, leaving the cabin in tense silence. Elena checked the aircraft's position and realized they were only minutes from landing. She could see the Bombardier Global 8000 clearly now, along with what appeared to be several black SUVs and a small crowd of people near the private terminal. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "we'll be landing in approximately 5 minutes. After we park, please remain in your seats until ground personnel have finished their procedures." Victoria looked out the window and saw the reception committee waiting for them. "There must be 20 people down there," she breathed. Mark leaned over to look. "Security legal team, probably some media relations people. This is going to be a circus." Tommy held up his phone. "Should I be recording this part?" "No," Kira said firmly. "What happens next is private family business." Elena began preparing the cabin for landing, but her mind was racing. In 15 years of private aviation, she'd never seen anything quite like this. A routine charter flight had become a profound lesson in prejudice, accountability, and redemption. As the aircraft touched down and began taxiing toward the terminal, Elena caught sight of a figure standing apart from the crowd near the Bombardier. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking David Thompson. He was tall, imposing, and radiating an aura of controlled power that was visible even from the aircraft. He wasn't pacing or gesticulating or showing any outward signs of agitation. He was simply standing perfectly still, waiting. Somehow that was the most intimidating thing of all. The aircraft came to a stop, and Elena heard the engines winding down. Through the cabin windows, she could see ground crews positioning stairs and preparing to open the door. In a few moments, Victoria Cross would have to walk down those stairs and face the man whose daughter she had spent an hour trying to humiliate. The most important meeting of her career was about to begin under circumstances she could never have imagined in her worst nightmares. Elena opened the cabin door and stepped aside. It was time to face the music. The stairs were wheeled into position with mechanical precision, but nobody moved toward the door. The cabin had become a pressure cooker of tension, with everyone suddenly reluctant to be the first to face whatever was waiting outside. Elena stood by the open door, feeling the warm Los Angeles air rush into the climate-controlled cabin. She could see David Thompson clearly now, a commanding figure in a dark suit standing motionless beside his aircraft. Even from a distance, his presence was magnetic and intimidating. "Miss Thompson," Elena said gently, Your father is waiting. Kira nodded and stood up, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. She walked to the front of the cabin with the same calm confidence she'd displayed throughout the flight, but Elena noticed her hands were trembling slightly. Before I go, Kira said, turning to address the other passengers, I want you all to remember something. What happened here today wasn't about me specifically. It was about a pattern of behavior that affects millions of people every day. The only difference is that this time there were consequences. She looked directly at Victoria. Ms. Cross, I meant what I said about believing people can change, but change requires action, not just words. What you do after today will determine whether this was a learning experience or just an embarrassing story you eventually forget. Victoria nodded, unable to speak. Kira walked to the door, then paused and looked back one more time. And to everyone else, the next time you see someone being treated the way I was treated today, I hope you'll remember this conversation and find your voices sooner. With that, she stepped through the door and began descending the stairs. Elena watched through the window as Kira walked across the tarmac toward her father. David Thompson didn't move until she was within arm's reach. Then he enveloped her in a hug that spoke of profound relief and love. They stood together for a long moment, the powerful CEO transformed into nothing more than a worried father holding his daughter safe. When they separated, Kira spoke to him quietly, too low for anyone in the aircraft to hear. Elena could see David's expression shift as Kira explained what had transpired during the flight. His initial relief was gradually replaced by something harder and more dangerous. After several minutes of conversation, David looked toward the aircraft and made a gesture. Two men in dark suits immediately broke away from the group near the terminal and began walking toward the stairs. "Oh God," Victoria whispered. "He's sending security for me." Mark grabbed her arm. "Carol, we need to have our story straight. We need to... Our story." Victoria turned on him with sudden fury. "Our story is that I'm a racist who tried to humiliate his daughter for an hour. There's no other story, Mark. There's no spin, no alternative narrative, no crisis management strategy that changes what I did." The security personnel reached the foot of the stairs. One of them called up to the cabin. "Ms. Victoria Cross and Mr. Mark Stevens, please disembark now." Victoria stood on unsteady legs. Her usual corporate armor of confidence and authority had completely disintegrated, leaving behind a middle-aged woman who looked fragile and defeated. Carol Mark said desperately, "Let me do the talking. I can." "No," Victoria said firmly. "I'm going to face this myself. I'm going to tell the truth about what I did, and I'm going to accept whatever consequences come from it." She walked to the door with as much dignity as she could muster, Mark trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. Elena watched from the cabin as Victoria descended the stairs. With each step, her shoulders seemed to slump further, as if the weight of her actions was physically pressing down on her. When Victoria reached the tarmac, David Thompson separated himself from his daughter and began walking toward her. Elena had seen many powerful men in her years of private aviation, but David Thompson commanded space in a way that was almost supernatural. He wasn't particularly tall or physically imposing, but his presence seemed to bend reality around him. Victoria stopped walking when David was still 10 feet away, as if she'd encountered an invisible barrier. David continued his approach until he was close enough that they could speak without raising their voices. From the aircraft, Elena couldn't hear the words being exchanged, but she could read the body language clearly. David Thompson was speaking in a low, controlled voice, his posture radiating quiet authority. Victoria was nodding frequently, her hands clasped in front of her like a penitent. The conversation lasted approximately 10 minutes. At one point, Victoria appeared to be crying, her shoulders shaking as David continued speaking. Mark stood several feet away, looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. Then something unexpected happened. David extended his hand toward Victoria. Elena blinked, certain she was misunderstanding what she was seeing, but no, David Thompson was offering to shake hands with the woman who had spent an hour harassing his daughter. Victoria stared at the extended hand for several seconds before tentatively reaching out to accept it. The handshake was brief and formal, but it was a handshake nonetheless. After that, David turned and walked back toward Kira, leaving Victoria and Mark standing alone on the tarmac. The security personnel escorted them toward the terminal, but it was clearly a courtesy rather than a forced march. Elena realized she was holding her breath. Whatever David Thompson had said to Victoria, it hadn't been the explosive confrontation everyone had expected. The remaining passengers began to disembark, filing past Elena with expressions of confusion and curiosity. None of them had expected the encounter to end so quietly. Carlos Rivera paused at the door. "That wasn't what I thought would happen," he said. "What did you expect?" Elena asked. "Honestly, I expected him to destroy her, publicly and completely. The fact that he didn't—" "What does that say?" Elena shook her head. "I have no idea." As the last passenger disembarked, Elena began her post-flight procedures, but her mind kept returning to the image of David Thompson shaking Victoria's hand. It was an act of grace that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances. Through the cabin window, she could see the Thompson family aircraft preparing for departure. Kira was already on board, but David was standing at the foot of the stairs speaking on his phone. Elena's own phone buzzed with a text message from the charter company's operations center: "Need full incident report ASAP." Media already asking questions. She looked out at the terminal building and saw several news vans arriving in the distance. Word of the incident was already spreading, and by tomorrow morning this story would likely be everywhere. But the real story, Elena realized, wasn't about a confrontation or a public humiliation. It was about a 19-year-old woman who had turned a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for education, and a father who had chosen grace over revenge. Elena began typing her incident report, wondering how she could possibly capture the complexity of what had transpired in the sterile language of corporate documentation. Some stories, she reflected, were too important for paperwork. The private terminal at Los Angeles International Airport's private aviation facility was designed for discretion and efficiency. High-profile passengers could arrive and depart without the chaos of commercial aviation, protected from paparazzi and crowds by careful logistics and strategic positioning. But tonight, the usually serene environment buzzed with unusual activity. David Thompson's Bombardier Global 8000 had landed 30 minutes earlier, and its arrival had set off a chain reaction throughout the facility. Ground crews moved with heightened urgency. Security personnel took up strategic positions, and several black SUVs materialized in the restricted area, as if summoned by invisible forces. Elena Rodriguez watched this choreographed response from the cabin of the Gulfstream G700, marveling at the difference between theoretical wealth and actual power. She'd served many wealthy passengers over her 15-year career, but she'd rarely seen such immediate and comprehensive mobilization of resources. David Thompson himself stood apart from the activity, a still center in the storm of preparation. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. But his wealth wasn't what commanded attention. It was the way he held himself, the aura of absolute authority that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a forge. Elena had researched Thompson Industries during her brief break between flights months earlier, curious about the family that flew their route so frequently. David Thompson had built his aerospace empire from a single government contract 30 years ago, transforming a small engineering firm into one of the most influential companies in the defense and civilian aviation sectors. Forbes estimated his net worth at $12 billion, but Elena suspected that number significantly underestimated his true wealth and influence. More importantly, David Thompson was known for his fierce protection of his family. There were stories in industry circles about business partners who had made the mistake of threatening or disrespecting his loved ones. Those people, Elena had heard, tended to find their careers mysteriously stalled. Their contracts, canceled, their reputations, quietly destroyed through channels they never saw coming. Victoria Cross had no idea what kind of enemy she had made. As Elena watched, a figure emerged from the bombardier and approached David. Elena recognized him as Marcus Chen Thompson's head of security, a former Secret Service agent who had been recruited personally by David 5 years earlier. Marcus spoke quietly into David's ear, gesturing toward their aircraft, which was just beginning its final approach. David's expression didn't change, but Elena saw his hands clench briefly at his sides. Whatever Marcus was telling him, it wasn't improving his mood. Elena activated the cabin intercom and spoke to her passengers one final time as they began their descent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be on the ground in approximately 10 minutes. I want to remind everyone that what happens next may be emotionally charged. I encourage you to remain calm and respectful regardless of how the situation develops." Victoria, who had been staring out the window in horrified fascination at the reception committee below, turned to Elena with desperate eyes. "Is there any way I could disembark privately? Away from—" All that, Elena shook her head sympathetically. "I'm sorry, Miss Cross. Mr. Thompson specifically requested that all passengers exit through the main door." The implication was clear. David Thompson wanted to see exactly who had been on the flight with his daughter. He wanted to look each of them in the eye and make his own assessment of their role in the events that had transpired. Mark Stevens, who had been frantically making phone calls to various crisis management consultants, finally put his phone away with a defeated expression. "No one wants to touch this," he reported to Victoria. "3 different firms have already declined to represent us. Word is spreading fast." Victoria nodded numbly. In the space of 3 hours, she had gone from being a rising star in the financial world to being radioactive. Her career wasn't just over, it was becoming a cautionary tale. The aircraft touched down with barely a whisper testament to the pilot's skill and the aircraft's advanced technology. As they taxied toward the private terminal, Elena could see David Thompson walking slowly toward the arrival area, flanked by Marcus and 2 other security personnel. Elena had expected him to pace or show visible signs of agitation, but David moved with the measured calm of someone who had learned to control his emotions even in the most stressful circumstances. That control, Elena realized, was probably more intimidating than any display of anger would have been. The aircraft came to a complete stop and Elena heard the engines winding down. She took a deep breath and prepared to open the cabin door, knowing that the next few minutes would change several lives forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "we have arrived in Los Angeles. Please remain seated until I give the all-clear for disembarkation." Through the window, Elena could see ground crews positioning the stairs. David Thompson stood approximately 50 feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting with the patience of someone who knew that time was on his side. Elena had worked in customer service long enough to recognize the signs of a man who was planning to have a very serious conversation with someone. David Thompson's demeanor wasn't that of an angry father preparing to explode. It was that of a CEO preparing to deliver consequences. Elena opened the cabin door and secured it in the open position. The warm Los Angeles air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of jet fuel and the distant hum of commercial aircraft operations. Kiera stood up immediately, but Elena gently placed a hand on her arm. "Miss Thompson," she said quietly, "are you prepared for this? Your father looks focused," Kiera finished. "Yes, I've seen that expression before. Usually right before someone's world gets turned upside down." Elena was struck again by Kira's maturity. Most 19-year-olds would be either crying or defiant in this situation. Kira seemed to understand exactly what was happening and accepted her role in the events that were about to unfold. "Are you going to be all right?" Elena asked. Kira smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, it was a completely genuine expression. "Elena, my father didn't build a $12 billion company by losing his temper or making rash decisions. Whatever he's planning to do, it will be fair, proportional, and designed to prevent this from happening to anyone else." She shouldered her backpack and walked toward the door. That's what should scare Miss Cross the most. Elena watched as Kira descended the stairs with the same composure she'd shown throughout the flight. Her father remained motionless until she was within 20 feet of him. Then his carefully controlled mask finally cracked. David Thompson's face transformed as he saw his daughter approaching safely. The CEO disappeared, replaced by a father whose child had been threatened. He closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides and pulled Kira into a fierce embrace that spoke of profound relief and love. Elena found herself wiping away tears as she watched the reunion. Whatever else happened today, this moment of pure parental love was something beautiful in the midst of all the ugliness. David held his daughter for a long moment, then stepped back and placed his hands on her shoulders, studying her face as if checking for damage. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "No, Dad. I'm fine. Really. Tell me what happened." "All of it." Kira took a breath and began speaking in low, measured tones. Elena couldn't hear the specific words, but she could see David's expression shifting as his daughter explained the events of the flight. His initial relief gradually hardened into something more dangerous. After several minutes of conversation, David looked toward the aircraft. His gaze swept across the windows, taking note of the faces pressed against the glass, cataloging each passenger who had been present during his daughter's ordeal. When his eyes found Victoria, Elena saw her physically recoil. Even through the aircraft window and across 50 feet of tarmac, David Thompson's focused attention was apparently terrifying. David spoke quietly to Marcus, who immediately began walking toward the aircraft. 2 additional security personnel fell in behind him, their movement casual but purposeful. Elena turned to address the remaining passengers. "Ms. Cross, Mr. Stevens, you're being asked to disembark first." Victoria stood on legs that seemed barely capable of supporting her weight. She had aged a decade during the flight, her usual corporate confidence replaced by the haunted expression of someone watching their life implode in real time. "Elena," she said quietly, "will you do me a favor? If I can. Whatever happens out there, please remember that I apologized. I know it doesn't undo what I did, but I want you to remember that I admitted I was wrong." Elena nodded. "I'll remember." Victoria walked to the door like a woman approaching the gallows. Mark followed behind her, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking. As they descended the stairs, Elena watched David Thompson's reaction carefully. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his stillness that suggested vast forces being held in check. Marcus met Victoria and Mark at the bottom of the stairs and escorted them across the tarmac. Elena expected them to be brought directly to David, but instead they were positioned approximately 30 feet away and asked to wait. David wasn't ready to speak with them yet. He was still talking with his daughter, still gathering information, still formulating his response. Elena realized she was witnessing a master strategist at work. David Thompson was treating this situation like a business negotiation, gathering all available information before making his move. The remaining passengers disembarked in order. Carlos Rivera, who walked across the tarmac with the confident stride of someone who knew he had nothing to hide. James Mitchell, whose earlier confidence had been replaced by obvious nervousness. Susan Blake, who moved with the careful dignity of someone acutely aware that her reputation was now part of this story. And finally, Tommy Martinez, who paused at the bottom of the stairs to pull out his phone before thinking better of it and putting it away. Each passenger was directed to a different position on the tarmac, creating a rough semicircle around David and Kira. Elena realized that David wanted to address them all simultaneously to make sure everyone heard the same message at the same time. Elena was the last to leave the aircraft, and as she descended the stairs, she found herself at the center of one of the most surreal situations of her career. Dozens of ground personnel, security officers, and Thompson Industries employees had gathered at a respectful distance, creating an audience for whatever was about to unfold. David Thompson finished his conversation with Kira and turned to face the assembled passengers. In the space of a few seconds, his demeanor shifted completely. The loving father disappeared, replaced by the CEO who had built an empire through intelligence, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept disrespect. When he spoke, his voice carried across the tarmac with the clarity and authority of someone accustomed to commanding large rooms full of powerful people. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "my name is David Thompson. Some of you know who I am. Others have apparently spent the last 3 hours learning who I am in rather unfortunate circumstances." His gaze swept across the group, pausing briefly on each face. "I'm told that during your flight my daughter was subjected to harassment, discrimination, and demands that she be removed from an aircraft that her family owns. I'm told that some of you participated in this behavior, some of you witnessed it in silence, and some of you eventually found the courage to speak up." Elena felt her heart racing. David Thompson's calm delivery was somehow more intimidating than shouting would have been. "I want each of you to understand something very clearly," he continued. "What happened on that aircraft today was not just an insult to my daughter. It was an assault on the principle that every human being deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their appearance, age, or perceived status." He paused, allowing his words to settle. "Now I have several options for how to respond to this situation. I could destroy the careers of everyone involved. I could ensure that you never work in your respective industries again. I could make this incident a viral news story that follows you for the rest of your lives." Victoria made a small whimpering sound. But David continued, "My daughter has asked me to consider a different approach. She believes that education is more powerful than punishment, and that people can change if they're given the opportunity to do so." Elena saw a glimmer of hope appear in Victoria's eyes. "So, I'm going to make each of you an offer," David said. "You can choose to learn from this experience and become better people, or you can choose to forget it and continue living as you have been. The choice is entirely yours." He gestured toward Victoria. "Ms. Cross, please step forward." Victoria Cross walked across the tarmac toward David Thompson with the measured pace of someone approaching their own execution. Each step seemed to require tremendous effort, as if she were walking through quicksand instead of solid ground. The distance between her and David couldn't have been more than 20 feet, but it felt like the longest walk of her life. David waited until Victoria was close enough for normal conversation before speaking. His voice was calm, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its control. "Ms. Cross, I understand you requested that my daughter be removed from my aircraft because you felt she didn't belong there." Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "Mr. Thompson, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am. I made a terrible mistake. I was completely wrong, and David held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Ms. Cross, I'm not interested in your apologies. Not yet. First, I want to understand your thought process. What specific factors led you to conclude that my daughter didn't belong on that aircraft?" The question was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel designed to expose the infected thinking that had led to Victoria's behavior. Victoria struggled for words that wouldn't further incriminate her. She was dressed casually and she looked young, and you assumed what I assumed, she couldn't afford to be there. Based on what criteria Victoria was trapped. Any honest answer would reveal the racist assumptions that had driven her actions. Based on how she looked, she admitted finally. "How she looked?" David repeated. "You mean because she's black?" The word hung in the air like an accusation. Victoria flinched as if she'd been struck. "I don't think of myself as a racist," she said desperately. "Ms. Cross, what you think about yourself is irrelevant. What matters is how you behave. And your behavior today was textbook racial profiling." Elena, watching from the edge of the group, was struck by David's methodical approach. He wasn't shouting or making emotional appeals. He was taking apart Victoria's worldview with the precision of an engineer solving a technical problem. "You saw a young black woman in casual clothing," David continued, "and you immediately assumed she was out of place. You demanded her removal without knowing anything about her background, her qualifications, or her right to be there. You made that assumption based purely on visual prejudice." Victoria was crying openly now, but David showed no signs of softening his approach. Furthermore, he said you escalated the situation by suggesting she was involved in corporate espionage, by demanding that the flight crew treat her as a security threat, and by rallying other passengers to support your position. You weaponized your perceived authority to attack someone you viewed as powerless. Each point was delivered with devastating accuracy. Victoria had no defense because there was no defense. "The irony," David said, "is that you were preparing to pitch my company while attacking my daughter. You were so focused on who you thought deserved respect that you completely missed who actually commanded it." Mark Stevens, who had been standing in horrified silence throughout this exchange, finally found his voice. "Mr. Thompson, sir, if I could just explain." "Mr. Stevens," David said without turning toward him, "your role in this situation is equally problematic. You witnessed harassment and chose to remain silent because you were more concerned about business implications than moral obligations. We'll discuss your behavior in a moment." Mark's face went ashen. David returned his attention to Victoria. "Ms. Cross, I want you to understand the full scope of what you've done today. You didn't just insult my daughter. You revealed a pattern of thinking that suggests you've been treating people this way for years. How many others have suffered your assumptions? How many careers have you damaged? How many dreams have you crushed because you decided someone didn't look like they belonged?" The questions were rhetorical, but they hit Victoria like physical blows. For the first time in her life, she was being forced to confront the cumulative impact of her prejudices. "I never thought about it that way," she whispered. "That's exactly the problem," David replied. "You never thought about it. You operated on autopilot, making assumptions and wielding power without considering the human cost." Elena noticed that, despite the harshness of his words, David's tone remained professional. He wasn't trying to humiliate Victoria. He was trying to educate her. The distinction was subtle but important. "Now," David said, "let me explain the consequences of your actions." Victoria braced herself for the blow. "Your firm's contract with Thompson Industries is terminated effective immediately. That includes the $15 billion deal you were here to pitch, as well as any future business relationships." Mark Stevens made a sound like a punctured balloon. "Additionally," David continued, "I will be contacting every major aerospace company, defense contractor, and government agency that my company works with. I will inform them of this incident and recommend that they evaluate their own relationships with Meridian Capital." Victoria's knees buckled slightly. The financial implications were staggering. Meridian Capital would likely be bankrupted by the loss of business David Thompson could orchestrate with a few phone calls. Finally, David said, "I will be documenting this incident and sharing it with industry publications as a case study in corporate discrimination. Your name and your firm's name will be attached to that story." The professional death sentence was now complete. Victoria's career wasn't just over. It was about to become a cautionary tale for an entire industry. But then David surprised everyone. "However," he said, "my daughter has convinced me that destruction isn't always the best teacher. She believes that people can change and that education is more powerful than punishment." Victoria looked up with desperate hope. "So I'm going to give you a choice," David continued. "You can accept these consequences and fade into well-deserved obscurity. Or you can choose to become a better person." What does that mean?" Victoria asked. "It means you can use this experience as a catalyst for genuine change. You can educate yourself about unconscious bias and structural inequality. You can volunteer with organizations that fight discrimination. You can become someone who speaks up when others are being mistreated instead of someone who perpetrates that mistreatment. David paused, studying Victoria's face. If you choose that path, if you demonstrate genuine commitment to change over the next year, I will consider modifying some of these consequences. Not eliminating them. Actions have costs, but potentially reducing them. Elena was amazed by the offer. David Thompson was providing a path to redemption for someone who had attacked his family. It was an act of grace that spoke to both his character and his daughter's influence. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what he was offering. Why, she asked finally. Why would you give me that chance? David glanced toward Kira, who had been watching the exchange with quiet intensity. Because my daughter reminded me that the goal isn't to destroy people who make mistakes. The goal is to create a world where those mistakes happen less frequently. He extended his hand toward Victoria. The question is, are you willing to do the work? Victoria stared at the offered handshake, a gesture of potential reconciliation from a man whose daughter she had tried to humiliate. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and grasped his hand. The handshake was firm but brief, a contract rather than a friendship. I'll do the work, Victoria said quietly. I promise I'll do the work. David nodded once, then turned to address Mark Stevens. Mr. Stevens, your situation is somewhat different. You didn't initiate the harassment, but you enabled it through your silence. You chose career advancement over moral clarity. Mark's face was pale as paper. Mr. Thompson, You have 2 weeks to find new employment, David said curtly. I will not be destroying your career, but I will also not be supporting it. You'll need to find your path forward without my assistance. It was a measured response, severe but not devastating. Mark nodded mutely, understanding that he was being shown more mercy than he probably deserved. David then turned to address the remaining passengers. Mr. Rivera, Miss Blake, Mr. Martinez, Miss Rodriguez, he said. I want to thank you for eventually finding the courage to speak up for my daughter. Your voices made a difference even if they came later than they should have. Carlos Rivera stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, I should have spoken up sooner. I was thinking about business implications instead of human decency. Yes, you were, David agreed. But you recognized your mistake and corrected it. That's what growth looks like. Susan Blake raised her hand hesitantly. Mr. Thompson, I want to do more than just apologize. I want to learn from this. Is there something concrete I can do? David smiled, the first truly warm expression he'd shown since his reunion with Kira. Miss Blake, if you're serious about that offer, I'll have my assistant contact you. We have several initiatives focused on combating discrimination in professional settings. Your experience today could be valuable in designing more effective interventions. Elena was struck by how David was transforming a moment of crisis into an opportunity for change. He wasn't just addressing the immediate problem, he was building a coalition to prevent future problems. Ladies and gentlemen, David said, addressing the entire group, what happened today was ugly, but it doesn't have to be meaningless. You can choose to forget this experience and return to your lives unchanged. Or you can choose to become better people because of it. He gestured toward his aircraft. Kira and I are leaving now. But this conversation, this moment, this choice that stays with you, what you do with it is up to you. As David and Kira walked toward the bombardier, Elena felt a profound sense of closure. She had witnessed something remarkable, a moment of cruelty transformed into an opportunity for growth. A pattern of discrimination challenged by voices that had found their courage, and a father's love channeled into a force for positive change. But she also knew that the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead. Would Victoria Cross follow through on her promise to change? Would the other passengers remember this moment when they encountered similar situations in the future? Only time would tell whether this flight had truly changed anyone's heart, or merely changed their behavior for a few hours in the spotlight. As David Thompson and Kira walked toward the Bombardier Global 8000, the assembled crowd on the tarmac began to disperse. But Elena noticed that several people were lingering as if reluctant to let the moment end. The confrontation had been so unexpected, so different from what anyone had anticipated, that it seemed to demand further processing. Tommy Martinez approached Elena as she gathered her flight materials. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, "I want to thank you for letting me record those interviews earlier. I think they captured something important." Elena nodded. "What will you do with them?" "Share them with my youth organization, like I mentioned. But I want to be careful about how they're used. This isn't about viral content or public shaming. It's about education. I think Miss Thompson would appreciate that distinction." Elena watched as Victoria Cross stood alone near the terminal building staring at her phone. Mark Stevens had disappeared, presumably, to begin the unpleasant task of explaining the day's events to their firm's partners. But Victoria remained seemingly unable to process what had just occurred. Carlos Rivera approached Victoria hesitantly. Elena couldn't hear their conversation from where she stood, but she could see Carlos speaking earnestly while Victoria listened and nodded. After several minutes, Carlos handed Victoria what appeared to be a business card before walking away. Elena found herself curious about this interaction. Carlos had been one of the few passengers to speak up for Kira during the flight, and his willingness to reach out to Victoria now suggested a genuine commitment to the redemptive vision David Thompson had articulated. Susan Blake approached Elena as she finished her post-flight documentation. "Miss Rodriguez, Susan said I need to ask you something. Do you really think people can change? I mean, really change, not just modify their behavior to avoid consequences?" Elena considered the question carefully. "I think people can change when they're forced to confront the cost of their current behavior. The question is whether they want to do the work." The work, Susan repeated. Mr. Thompson used that phrase too. What does that actually look like? Honest self-examination. Education. Putting yourself in uncomfortable situations where you have to question your assumptions. Most people aren't willing to do it because it's painful and it doesn't offer immediate rewards. Susan nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about my own behavior today. I pride myself on supporting social justice causes, but when injustice happened right in front of me, I froze. I was more concerned about maintaining social harmony than standing up for what's right. What will you do differently next time?" "Speak up immediately. Disrupt the harmony if necessary. I realized today that my silence was a choice, and it was the wrong choice." Elena felt a spark of hope. If the flight had produced even one person willing to genuinely examine their behavior and commit to change, perhaps it had been worth all the trauma. James Mitchell, who had been notably quiet since David Thompson's speech, approached the two women. "I owe both of you an apology," he said formally. "My behavior today was inexcusable. I sided with Ms. Cross because I thought it would benefit my career, not because I believed she was right." Elena studied his face, trying to determine whether his remorse was genuine or strategic. "What changed your mind?" she asked, watching Miss Thompson's grace under pressure, seeing how she handled herself with dignity while being attacked. "It made me realize that real strength isn't about having power over others. It's about maintaining your principles when others are trying to break you." His words had the ring of sincerity, but Elena had learned to be cautious about deathbed conversions. People often discovered their moral clarity when the consequences of their choices became clear. "Mr. Mitchell," Susan Blake said, "if you're serious about learning from this experience, I'd like to invite you to attend a workshop on unconscious bias that my foundation sponsors. It might help you understand the thinking patterns that led to your decision to support Ms. Cross." James looked surprised by the offer. "You'd do that?" "Even after especially because you made that mistake," Susan replied. Redemption isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to be better. Elena was struck by how quickly Susan Blake had absorbed David Thompson's message about education over punishment. The woman was already translating her experience into concrete action. Across the tarmac, Victoria Cross was still standing alone, still staring at her phone. Elena made a decision and walked over to her. "Miss Cross," Elena said gently, "are you all right?" Victoria looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't know how to process what just happened. I expected to be destroyed. I deserved to be destroyed, but instead you were offered a chance to become better. Why? Why would he do that after what I did to his daughter?" Elena thought about David Thompson's measured response, his calm professionalism in the face of an attack on his family. "Because he understands something that most people don't," Elena said. "Revenge feels good in the moment, but it doesn't solve problems. It just creates new ones. If he had destroyed you publicly, you would have become a victim in your own mind. You would have blamed him for your downfall instead of taking responsibility for your choices." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "What if I can't change?" she asked finally. "What if this is just who I am?" "Then you'll have to live with that choice." "But Ms. Cross, the fact that you're asking the question suggests you're already starting to change." Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from the charter company's operations center, board of directors, requesting immediate conference call regarding incident. Media interest escalating rapidly. Elena sighed. The broader implications of the day's events were just beginning to unfold. By tomorrow morning, this story would likely be international news dissected and analyzed by pundits and social media influencers around the world. But Elena found herself less concerned about the media circus than about the individuals who had been present for the actual events. Would Victoria Cross follow through on her promise to do better? Would the other passengers remember this moment when they faced similar situations in the future? Would the lesson stick, or would it fade into just another anecdote about the time they were on a flight with difficult passengers? As Elena walked toward the terminal to file her incident report, she noticed that the Thompson family aircraft was still on the ground. Through its windows, she could see David and Kira in conversation, debriefing the day's events. Elena realized that for the Thompson family, this incident was probably just one of many occasions when they'd had to deal with discrimination. The difference was that this time, there had been witnesses and consequences. This time, the perpetrator had been forced to confront the full cost of their assumptions. Elena's phone rang. The caller ID showed her supervisor's number. "Elena, I need a full briefing on what happened during that flight. The CEO of the charter company is fielding calls from reporters, and we need to get ahead of this story." Elena took a deep breath and began walking toward the terminal. "It's a long story," she said, "and it doesn't have a simple ending." As she spoke, Elena could see Victoria Cross in the distance, finally walking away from the tarmac. The woman moved slowly, as if each step required conscious decision-making. She was no longer the confident corporate executive who had boarded the aircraft in New York. She was someone fundamentally changed, whether for better or worse remained to be seen. Elena realized that she had witnessed something rare, a moment when abstract concepts like prejudice, privilege, and accountability had been made concrete and personal. Everyone involved would carry this experience forward, but what they did with it would determine whether the day had any lasting meaning. The real consequences were just beginning. 6 months later, Kira Thompson sat in her dorm room at NYU putting the finishing touches on a project that had consumed her thoughts since that confrontational flight to Los Angeles. Her small, single room was cluttered with sketches, draft manuscripts, and reference materials spread across every available surface. The leather-bound sketchbook from the flight sat open on her desk, its pages now filled with drawings that captured not just faces and expressions, but entire emotional landscapes. The graphic novel she'd been working on was unlike anything she'd created before. It wasn't a simple narrative of good versus evil, victim versus perpetrator. It was a complex exploration of how ordinary people could become complicit in patterns of discrimination and how those same people could choose to become agents of change. The title page read, Seat 3B Stories of Belonging. Kira's phone buzzed with a text from her father. Lunch today, I have updates on the Meridian situation. She smiled and texted back Cafe Luna at 1 p.m. Want to hear everything. David Thompson had been true to his word about monitoring the aftermath of the flight incident. He'd established what he privately called the Victoria Cross Index, a way of tracking whether the people involved in the incident were following through on their commitments to change. At noon, Kira gathered her materials and walked across campus to Cafe Luna, a small restaurant near Washington Square Park that had become their regular meeting spot. David was already there, sitting at their usual corner table, dressed in his typical off-duty uniform of dark jeans and a button-down shirt. Without the formal business attire, he looked like any other parent visiting their college-age child. "How's the book coming?" he asked as Kira sat down. "Almost finished. I think you'll be surprised by how I chose to tell the story." "Good surprised or concerned surprised?" Kira laughed. "You'll have to read it to find out. But I think it's honest without being vindictive. It focuses on the choices people made and the consequences that followed." David nodded approvingly. "Speaking of consequences, I have news about Ms. Cross. Good news or bad news?" "Both, actually. The good news is that she's followed through on her commitment to change. She's completed 2 different unconscious bias training programs. She's volunteering with a nonprofit that provides business mentoring to underrepresented entrepreneurs, and she's spoken at 3 different corporate diversity events about her experience. And the bad news, Meridian Capital collapsed 6 weeks ago. The loss of our contract, combined with several other clients who decided they didn't want to be associated with the firm after the story went public, was too much for them to absorb. The firm filed for bankruptcy and was dissolved." Kira was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "How do you feel about that?" she asked. David considered the question carefully. "Conflicted. I didn't set out to destroy an entire company just to hold specific individuals accountable for their actions, but the firm's collapse suggests that their problems went deeper than one incident. Other clients had apparently been looking for reasons to leave. What about the employees who had nothing to do with what happened? Most of them found positions with other firms. I made some calls to ensure that qualified people weren't unfairly punished for their colleagues' behavior. It was a typical David Thompson response fare, but thorough considering all stakeholders while maintaining clear boundaries. "What about Victoria herself?" Kira asked. "That's where the story gets more interesting. She couldn't find employment in financial services. The industry blacklisting was too comprehensive. But she used her settlement money from the firm's bankruptcy to start something new." David pulled out his phone and showed Kira a website. Cross Consulting specializes in helping companies identify and eliminate discriminatory practices in their hiring and promotion processes. Her personal experience with bias has become her professional expertise. Kira studied the website with interest. Victoria's headshot showed a woman who looked older and wiser than the person who had demanded her removal from the aircraft. The bio was honest about her past mistakes while positioning them as qualifications for her current work. "Is she successful?" "Surprisingly, yes. Her willingness to publicly acknowledge her own prejudices has given her credibility with companies that want to address these issues but don't trust traditional consultants who've never grappled with their own biases." Kira felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her was pleased that Victoria had found a way to transform her experience into something positive, but another part wondered whether this redemption story was too neat, too convenient. "Do you think she's genuinely changed, or is she just good at marketing herself?" "Has changed?" David smiled at his daughter's perceptiveness. "That's the right question to ask. Based on reports from people who've worked with her, I think the change is genuine. She's apparently very direct about calling out discriminatory behavior even when it costs her business. Has she tried to contact me? She sent a letter through my office about 3 months ago. I've been holding it, waiting to see if you wanted to read it. David pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. Kira's name was written on the front in careful handwriting. Kira took the letter but didn't open it immediately. What about the others? The other passengers. Mark Stevens found a position with a smaller firm in Boston. He's apparently become something of an advocate for ethical business practices, though I suspect that's more about career rehabilitation than genuine conversion. David paused to take a sip of his coffee. James Mitchell has been more impressive. He joined Susan Blake's foundation and has been working on corporate bias initiatives. He's used his connections in the business world to push for policy changes that he probably would have opposed before the flight. And Susan herself. She's funding a research project on bystander intervention in professional settings. She's particularly interested in understanding why good people often stay silent when they witness discrimination. Kira nodded. What about Carlos Rivera? He's been in touch regularly. His company has implemented some of the most comprehensive anti-discrimination policies in the tech industry, and he credits our conversation with inspiring that work. And Tommy Martinez David's expression brightened. Tommy has been remarkable. He's used the video interviews from the flight to create training materials for his youth organization. More importantly, he's started a scholarship fund for students from underrepresented communities who want to pursue careers in aviation. Kira felt a warm sense of pride. Tommy's response had been the most authentic from the beginning, and it was gratifying to see him channeling that authenticity into concrete action. Elena Rodriguez has also been in touch, David continued. She's working with the charter company to develop new protocols for handling discrimination complaints on private flights. She wants to ensure that flight crews are empowered to intervene immediately when passengers are being harassed. Kira finally opened Victoria's letter. It was handwritten on simple stationery with no corporate letterhead or professional polish. The writing was personal and direct. Dear Kira, I know you have no obligation to read this letter and even less obligation to respond to it. But I needed to write it anyway, as much for myself as for you. I want you to know that not a day has passed since our flight that I haven't thought about my behavior and its impact on you. I've spent 6 months trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could treat another human being the way I treated you. The work has been painful but necessary. I've had to confront ugly truths about my assumptions, my privileges, and my willingness to use power against people I perceived as vulnerable. I've also had to confront the fact that you weren't my first victim. There have been others over the years, service workers, young employees, anyone I thought couldn't challenge my authority. I may never know the full extent of the damage I've caused, but I'm committed to ensuring it doesn't continue. My consulting business isn't penance or reputation management. It's the most honest work I've ever done because it forces me to stay conscious of the biases I'm trying to overcome. Every day I help other people recognize the same patterns I exhibited on that flight. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect absolution. But I want you to know that your grace under pressure taught me something about strength that I'd never understood before. You could have destroyed me with a phone call, but instead you chose to educate me. That choice changed my life. I hope your life has been filled with people who recognize your worth immediately without having to be taught. You deserve that. Everyone deserves that. With profound respect and gratitude. Victoria Cross. Kira read the letter twice before looking up at her father. What do you think? David asked. I think she means it. I think the change is real. Does that matter to you? Kira considered the question. It matters because it means the flight accomplished something beyond just making us feel vindicated. If Victoria has spent 6 months becoming a better person because of what happened, then maybe the whole ugly experience had value. David reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not just for how you handled yourself on that flight, but for how you've processed everything that came after. A lot of people would have used this situation to become bitter or cynical. You've used it to become wiser." Kira smiled. "I had a good teacher. You could have destroyed everyone involved, but instead you chose to create opportunities for growth. That taught me more about real power than any business lesson ever could. What will you do with the letter I think I'll write back? Not because I need to, but because dialogue is how change happens. If Victoria is genuinely trying to become better, then engaging with her might help that process." As they finished lunch and prepared to leave, David asked one final question. "Any regrets about how everything unfolded?" Kira thought for a moment. "Only one," she said. "I wish it hadn't been necessary. I wish we lived in a world where a 19-year-old black woman could sit quietly on a plane without having her presence questioned. But since we don't live in that world yet, I'm glad we used the situation to push things in the right direction." Walking back across campus, Kira felt a sense of completion. The graphic novel would be finished soon, and with it her processing of the flight incident. But the lessons learned and the relationships formed would continue to evolve. She pulled out her phone and began composing a response to Victoria's letter. It was time to close one chapter and begin writing the next. 1 year after the incident, David Thompson stood in his corner office on the 40th floor of Thompson Industries headquarters in Seattle, reviewing a comprehensive report on what his staff had privately dubbed the Cross Initiative. The view from his window stretched across Elliott Bay to the Olympic Mountains, but his attention was focused on the documents spread across his desk. The initiative had grown far beyond his original intention of simply holding individuals accountable for their actions. What had begun as a response to his daughter's harassment had evolved into an industry-wide examination of discrimination in professional settings. Marcus Chen, David's head of security, knocked on the open office door. "You asked for an update on the flight incident follow-ups," Marcus said, carrying a thick folder. "Come in. I've been reviewing the annual report, but I want to hear your assessment of how sustainable these changes are." Marcus took a seat across from David's desk and opened his folder. "Let's start with the positive developments. The charter aviation industry has implemented significant policy changes. Elena Rodriguez's protocols for addressing passenger harassment have been adopted by every major private aviation company in North America. Flight crews now have clear authority to remove passengers who engage in discriminatory behavior, and there's an industry-wide database of passengers who've been banned for such conduct." David nodded approvingly. "Concrete change. That's what I was hoping for. The ripple effects have been broader than we anticipated. 3 major corporations have revised their travel policies to explicitly prohibit discriminatory behavior by employees using company-funded transportation. 2 business schools have added case studies about the incident to their ethics curricula." Marcus turned to the next section of his report. "Victoria Cross's consulting business has been more successful than anyone predicted. She's worked with 47 companies in the past year, and follow-up surveys suggest her interventions have resulted in measurable improvements in workplace culture. More importantly, she's trained over 200 HR professionals to recognize and address unconscious bias. Any indicators that this is performance rather than genuine change? I had our people do deep background checks. She's turned down lucrative contracts with companies that wanted her to rubber stamp their diversity efforts without doing real work. She's also donated 60% of her profits to organizations that combat discrimination. The financial sacrifice suggests authentic commitment." David was impressed despite himself. He'd expected Victoria to attempt superficial reputation rehabilitation, but the evidence suggested genuine transformation. "What about the other passengers?" Mark Stevens has been less impressive but not problematic. He's kept a low profile, followed the ethical guidelines at his new firm, but hasn't become an active advocate for change. Adequate, but uninspiring. Marcus flipped to the next page. James Mitchell has surprised everyone. His work with Susan Blake's foundation has resulted in new bias intervention programs at 12 major corporations. He's used his network and credibility to push for changes that outside consultants couldn't have achieved, and he's maintained this commitment for a full year, 14 months now. By all accounts, his conversion appears genuine. He's taken significant personal financial losses to support initiatives that his former peer group sees as threatening to their interests. David felt a grudging respect for Mitchell's willingness to sacrifice social and professional capital for his principles. Susan Blake has been extraordinary. Marcus continued. Her foundation's bystander intervention research has produced training programs now used by 53 corporations. She's turned her personal shame about her silence into fuel for change. The research findings fascinating and disturbing. They've documented that the average professional witnesses discriminatory behavior 2.3 times per month, but intervenes only 8% of the time. However, when companies implement bystander intervention training, that rate increases to 67%. David made a note to discuss implementing such training at Thompson Industries. Carlos Rivera's company has become a model for inclusive corporate culture. He's shared his policies and practices with dozens of other tech companies, and several have adopted similar approaches. His quarterly bias audits are being studied as a potential industry standard. Tommy Martinez. Marcus smiled. Tommy has been perhaps the most impactful of all. His scholarship fund has supported 43 students, and his youth organization's training materials are now used by similar groups in 18 states. He's turned one flight into a movement. David felt a deep satisfaction. Tommy's authentic response during the flight had suggested real character, and his follow-through confirmed that assessment. Elena Rodriguez has leveraged her experience into a consulting career focused on customer service discrimination. She's working with hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and transportation companies to train staff on respectful service, regardless of customer appearance or perceived status. Marcus closed his folder and looked directly at David. Overall assessment, this incident has produced more positive change than we could have achieved through traditional advocacy or philanthropy. The personal nature of the confrontation, combined with the consequences that followed, created a powerful case study that's influenced policy at dozens of organizations. David leaned back in his chair, processing the information. Any negative developments? Some backlash in certain circles. Victoria Cross has received death threats from people who see her as a traitor to her race and class. Tommy Martinez faced criticism in his community for making trouble instead of staying quiet. Elena Rodriguez lost some clients who didn't appreciate her willingness to call out discriminatory behavior, but they've all maintained their commitments despite the pressure. So far, yes. The personal cost of speaking up hasn't deterred any of them from continuing their work. David stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. What about Kira? How has this affected her? Your daughter has processed this experience with remarkable maturity. Her graphic novel is being published by Norton next month, and early reviews suggest it will have significant cultural impact. She's been invited to speak at 6 universities about dignity discrimination and the power of individual choice. Is she comfortable with that level of public attention? She seems to be, but she's been selective about opportunities focusing on educational settings rather than media appearances. She wants to teach, not just tell her story. David turned back to Marcus. Recommendation for continued monitoring. I suggest quarterly check-ins for another year, then annual follow-ups after that. The changes appear to be sustainable, but continued accountability will help ensure they remain so. David nodded agreement. The initiative had exceeded his expectations, but he knew that real change required sustained effort over time. As Marcus prepared to leave, David asked one final question. If you had to summarize the key lesson from this entire experience, what would it be? Marcus considered carefully. That consequences and accountability can be more powerful than punishment and revenge. Every person involved in this incident faced real costs for their choices, but they were also given opportunities to grow. That combination of accountability and grace created change that pure punishment couldn't have achieved. After Marcus left, David returned to his desk and opened his laptop. He began typing an email to his senior staff. "I want to schedule a company-wide discussion about implementing bystander intervention training and bias audits throughout Thompson Industries. Recent research suggests these programs can significantly improve workplace culture while reducing legal and reputational risks. This isn't about political correctness or social trends. This is about creating an environment where all our employees can contribute their best work without worrying about whether they're accepted or respected. Please prepare recommendations for implementation by our next leadership meeting." David sent the email and looked out at the Seattle skyline one more time. Kira's experience on that flight had been painful and unnecessary, but it had also become a catalyst for changes that would benefit thousands of people. Sometimes the most important victories came from the battles you never wanted to fight. 2 years after the flight incident, Kira Thompson stood at the podium in NYU's Eisner and Lubin Auditorium, looking out at an audience of 500 students, faculty, and community members who had come to hear her speak as part of the university's annual Social Justice Symposium. Her graphic novel, Seat 3B, Stories of Belonging, had been published 6 months earlier and had become a phenomenon that surprised everyone, including her. The book wasn't a simple narrative of victimization and triumph. Instead, it explored the complex psychology of discrimination through interconnected stories of ordinary people making choices about how to treat each other. Critics had praised its nuanced portrayal of both perpetrators and bystanders, noting that it avoided easy answers while providing hope for genuine change. When people asked me about the flight, Kira began her voice carrying easily through the auditorium's sound system. They often want to know if I was angry. "Were you furious? Did you want revenge? Did you call your father immediately to make them pay?" She paused, scanning the audience. The honest answer is that I felt sad more than angry. I was sad that a successful, educated woman looked at me and saw a threat to be eliminated rather than a person to be respected. I was sad that other passengers initially stayed silent, not because they agreed with her, but because speaking up felt risky. I was sad that this kind of interaction happens thousands of times every day, usually without consequences or learning. A student in the third row raised her hand. "How did you maintain your composure? I would have lost it completely." Kira smiled. "I almost did lose it. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to call her every name I could think of to make her feel as small as she was trying to make me feel. But my father had taught me something important. When someone is trying to provoke you into behaving badly, your dignity becomes your most powerful weapon." "What do you mean by that?" another student asked. "Think about what would have happened if I had responded with anger and aggression. Victoria Cross could have pointed to my reaction as justification for her original assumptions. She could have said, 'See, I knew she didn't belong here. Look how she's acting.' My calm response forced her to confront her own behavior without any distractions." An older woman in the back raised her hand. "But doesn't that place an unfair burden on the victims of discrimination? Why should you have to be perfect when someone else is being horrible?" It was a question Kira had wrestled with extensively. "You're absolutely right that it's unfair," she replied. "Victims of discrimination shouldn't have to be superhuman to deserve respect. But I've learned that there's a difference between what should be true and what is true. In an ideal world, I could have responded however I wanted and still been treated with dignity. In the real world, my response affected how everyone else in that cabin understood the situation." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a page from her graphic novel depicting the moment when Tommy Martinez put down his phone and chose to speak rather than record. "The most important part of the story isn't how I handled being attacked. It's how other people chose to respond when they witnessed that attack. Some stayed silent, some eventually spoke up, and some became genuine allies. Those choices had nothing to do with me and everything to do with their own character. A faculty member in the middle section stood up. Your book has been praised for its portrayal of the passengers who initially remained silent. You show them as complex people rather than villains. Can you talk about that choice? Kira nodded. I spent a lot of time thinking about why good people sometimes fail to act when they witness injustice. I realized that most of them aren't motivated by malice. They're paralyzed by uncertainty, social conditioning, or fear of making things worse. She clicked to another slide showing a panel from her book where Susan Blake wrestles with her decision to stay quiet. Susan Blake writes checks to fight discrimination, but when it happened in front of her, she froze. That doesn't make her evil. It makes her human. The question is what she did after recognizing her failure to act. And what did she do? She used her resources and influence to study why people like her stay silent, and then she created training programs to help others overcome that paralysis. She turned her failure into fuel for change. A young man near the front asked, "What about Victoria Cross? Do you really believe people can change that fundamentally?" Kira had been expecting this question. Victoria's transformation had been the most controversial aspect of her book's reception. "I've met with Victoria several times over the past year," Kira said. "I've seen her work, talked to people she's helped, observed how she handles situations where her old patterns might resurface. Based on that evidence, yes, I believe her change is genuine. But how can you be sure? I can't be absolutely certain. But I've learned that demanding absolute certainty is often an excuse for avoiding difficult decisions. The evidence suggests Victoria has genuinely confronted her biases and committed to doing better. Choosing to believe in that change while remaining vigilant seems more productive than permanent cynicism." An older gentleman in the faculty section raised his hand. "Miss Thompson, your father's response to this incident has been studied in business schools as an example of proportional accountability. Can you talk about his decision-making process?" Kira's expression softened when discussing her father. "My dad could have destroyed everyone involved. He had the power and arguably the justification, but he understood that destruction doesn't usually create learning. Instead, he imposed consequences that were meaningful but not permanent, and he created opportunities for people to prove they could do better." She clicked to a slide showing a timeline of changes that had resulted from the incident. 2 years later, we can measure the impact of his approach. The aviation industry has new policies protecting passengers from harassment. Dozens of corporations have implemented bias intervention training. Victoria Cross has helped 47 companies improve their workplace cultures. Tommy Martinez has created opportunities for 53 students who might not have had them otherwise. So you're saying revenge would have been less effective. I'm saying that revenge would have felt good in the moment, but wouldn't have prevented the next Victoria Cross from harassing the next young woman on the next flight. Accountability, combined with opportunities for redemption, created changes that will outlast all of us. During the question and answer session that followed, Kira was struck by how many audience members seemed hungry for practical guidance about confronting discrimination in their own lives. "What should I do if I witness harassment in my workplace?" one woman asked. "Start by documenting what you see, dates, times, witnesses, specific behaviors. Then follow your company's reporting procedures if they exist. If they don't exist or aren't effective, consider reaching out to external resources like the EEOC or relevant professional organizations. What if speaking up puts my job at risk? That's a legitimate concern and I won't minimize it. But I'll ask you this. What's the cost of staying silent, to the person being harassed, to your own integrity, to the workplace? Culture, you're implicitly accepting." A student raised her hand. "Do you think incidents like yours are becoming more common, or are they just getting more attention?" "Both," Kira replied. I think discriminatory behavior has always been common, but social media and changing social norms have made the consequences more immediate and public. That's creating pressure for genuine change, but it's also creating backlash from people who preferred the old system. As the formal presentation concluded, Kira reflected on how much her understanding of the incident had evolved. What had begun as a painful personal experience had become a lens for examining broader social dynamics and a catalyst for meaningful change. The real test, she knew, would be whether the lessons learned and structures created would survive beyond the immediate aftermath of the incident. Would the aviation industry maintain its new anti-harassment policies? Would the corporations that had implemented bias training continue those programs? Would the individuals who had committed to change maintain that commitment when public attention moved elsewhere? During the reception following her talk, Kira was approached by a young black woman who looked to be about her age. "Miss Thompson," the woman said, "I wanted to thank you for your book. I'm a first-year medical student, and last month I was questioned by a nurse who didn't believe I belonged in the hospital. I remembered your story and how you handled yourself with dignity. It helped me stay calm and address the situation professionally. What happened? I reported it to the attending physician, who had a conversation with the nurse. 2 days later, the nurse apologized and asked if I would help train new staff on avoiding unconscious bias. We're actually working together now to create better protocols." Kira felt a deep satisfaction. This was why she'd chosen to write the book, to speak publicly, to keep the conversation alive. Not for personal vindication, but to give others tools for handling similar situations with grace and effectiveness. As the evening wound down, Kira received a text from her father. "Watched the live stream. Proud of you. Coffee tomorrow to discuss the publishing house's offer?" She smiled and texted back Cafe Luna at 1 p.m. "And yes, I think I'm ready for the next project." Walking back to her dorm through Washington Square Park, Kira reflected on the journey from that confrontational flight to this moment of recognition and impact. The scared 19-year-old who had been harassed for her appearance had become a voice for dignity and change, not through anger or revenge, but through the patient work of education and example. The legacy of Seat 3B would be measured not in viral moments or public humiliations, but in the quiet choices made by people who remembered the story and decided to act with greater courage and compassion. That was real justice. That was lasting change. 5 years after the incident, on a crisp October morning, Kira Thompson walked across the stage at Madison Square Garden to accept the inaugural Dignity in Action Award from the National Civil Rights Foundation. The award recognized individuals who had transformed personal experiences with discrimination into catalysts for change. As she looked out at the audience of 3,000 advocates, educators, and community leaders, Kira spotted familiar faces in the third row. Victoria Cross sat next to Elena Rodriguez, both of them applauding with genuine warmth. Tommy Martinez was there with 5 of his scholarship recipients. Susan Blake and James Mitchell had flown in from different cities to attend. Even Carlos Rivera had arranged his schedule to be present. In the front row, David Thompson sat with tears in his eyes, watching his daughter receive recognition that validated everything he had taught her about dignity, strength, and the power of choosing grace over revenge. 5 years ago, Kira began her voice carrying clearly through the arena. I was a teenager on an airplane who was told I didn't belong. Today I stand here knowing that belonging isn't something others grant you, it's something you claim for yourself and extend to others. She paused, looking directly at Victoria Cross. This award isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who chose to learn from that difficult day, who decided that moments of cruelty could become opportunities for growth, who proved that people really can change if they're willing to do the work. The audience rose in sustained applause, but Kira's attention was focused on the small group from the flight. They had become an unlikely family bound together not by the conflict that brought them together, but by their shared commitment to making sure it led somewhere meaningful. After the ceremony, as the group gathered for dinner at a small restaurant near the venue, Elena Rodriguez raised her glass. To seat 3B, she said simply, "And to all the seats that will be safer because of what we learned there." They drank to the memory of a moment that could have ended in bitterness, but instead became a beginning. The young woman who had been told she didn't belong had created space for others to belong. The system that had failed her had been reformed. The people who had failed each other had become better. Victoria Cross pulled Kira aside as the evening wound down. "I need you to know something," she said quietly. "Not a day goes by that I don't remember who I was on that flight. And not a day goes by that I don't choose to be someone different. Thank you for believing that was possible." Kira squeezed her hand. "Thank you for proving it was true." As they walked out into the New York night, Kira reflected that the most powerful victories weren't the ones that destroyed your enemies, but the ones that transformed them into allies. Real justice wasn't about punishment. It was about ensuring that everyone could sit in their seat with dignity, knowing they belonged not because of how they looked or what they wore, but simply because they were human. That was the legacy of Seat 3B. That was the future they had built one conversation and one choice at a time. If this story touched your heart and made you think about the power of dignity over revenge, please hit that like button. Stories like this deserve to be shared with everyone who needs a reminder that change is possible when we choose education over destruction. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring true stories that show how ordinary people can create extraordinary change. And most importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters, their dignity is non-negotiable, and that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is grace. What would you have done in Kira's situation? How do you handle moments when someone underestimates you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to find their voice. Remember, every time you speak up for someone who's being mistreated, every time you choose understanding over judgment, every time you believe that people can change, you're continuing the legacy of Seat 3B. You're proving that real justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure no one has to fight for their basic dignity alone. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our stories of courage, redemption, and the power of human connection. Because the next story might be the one that changes everything for someone who really needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and remember, you belong wherever you choose to put yourself. Never let anyone convince you otherwise.